When it comes to Southern politics and race relations around the country, Jack Bass knows all about it. In this special edition of Quintin's Close-Ups, I speak exclusively with him one-on-one. Jack, it is so good to see you.
Good seeing you.
Yes, sir. You know, when I talked with you via email yesterday, you told me you're in Columbia all day.
I was in Columbia all day yesterday.
Tell me, how are you?
I'm fine.
Yes. So let me create the scene. We're sitting here in your home in downtown Charleston. And as you know, the 1-year anniversary of the tragedy at Mother Emanuel is coming up on Friday. When you think of that 1 year later, what memories play back in your mind?
Well, the biggest memory in my mind was I got up at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the morning the day Obama was going to speak.
Right.
And I stood in line for about 2 hours and a half.
Wow.
And my wife froze a bottle of water.
Right.
It was frozen, totally frozen. So I had that with me during the morning.
Yeah.
And when I got finally to the gate,
right,
they closed the gate with 3 people in front of me. But then after about 10 minutes, they opened it up and more of us got in.
Oh, thank God. Thank God. And I know that you specialize obviously in race relations and Southern politics. What sticks out in your mind when you think of Mother Emanuel, the church?
Well, the first time I was there was when Martin Luther King spoke in the 1960s, and I was a reporter. Then I was the Columbia Bureau Chief of the Charlotte Observer. And I remember it kind of vividly because the whole call and response, you know, and he was just speaking as a preacher.
Yes.
But it was pretty powerful.
Wow.
It was pretty powerful. It's one of the few times he spoke in South Carolina.
Wow.
You know, he did a lot of his book. He did his book writing down at Penn Center in Beaufort County.
Right.
There was always an FBI agent there on duty, sort of keeping an eye on him.
Wow. Wow. Speaking of books, let's talk about your book back in 1972 called Porgy Comes Home. When you look back at 1972 to right now, what sticks out in your mind when you think of Porgy Comes Home?
Well, Porgy, the whole background of that book is I was then the New York Times stringer in South Carolina, the non-staff correspondent. The Times had a book publishing company and they were going to do a series of books about the states. So I wrote my manuscript and it got accepted and then they dropped the whole project.
Wow.
And so then Governor John West had a photograph of him with his staff, and he was the first governor to have African Americans on his staff. Jim Clyburn was there in the picture. He asked me what the status of the book was, so I told him, and he said, would you be interested in having it published locally? And I said, sure.
Wow.
Next day I get a call from the president of the largest printing company in Columbia who did all the state's printing, said, I heard you have a book. So that's how the book came out. And it came out because I'd gone to cover as a reporter, but also as someone interested in going anyway.
Right.
When Porgy and Bess first played in Charleston in 1970, part of the state's tricentennial, because it represented, it symbolized change, real change. You know, they had an all-local cast, and you had the sort of upper element, social element, of white social element in Charleston, who felt, well, they had to have a party for the cast. And that was a real breakthrough socially in the whole state. And to me it sort of symbolized this change that was point of change in South Carolina. And I think it really was.
Yes, indeed. Now, let's talk about 2016. Everyone in Charleston was just mesmerized when the Splato Festival brought Porgy and Bess to the festival. As you know, they didn't have it in time for the first festival back in the 1970s. So when you heard that they brought it back this time, what was going to your mind?
Well, I wanted to go.
Yes.
And unfortunately, we went the first night, and they still didn't have the thing structured properly. They didn't have you couldn't, now later on they put up, you could read the dialogue.
Right.
But we were up in the cheap $100 seats sitting in the balcony, just a few rows back.
Right.
But you couldn't hear anything. The only voice you could hear was Porgy singing.
Oh.
You couldn't hear any of the female singers.
Wow.
And we ended up just leaving after the first act.
Wow. Wow.
But then I understand they got a lot of it straightened out later. But
oh, that's awesome. Well,
but we went to the chamber music concert, and that was just exceptional and outstanding.
Yeah.
And then we went to another play at Dock Street Theater, and thoroughly enjoyed that.
Wow.
And so this year we didn't do as much as we usually do,
Okay.
but but what we did do, we thoroughly enjoyed.
That's awesome. Well, describe to me the following in one word: the Orangeburg Massacre.
Well, the Orangeburg Massacre is the most unknown major event in civil rights history in the United States.
Southern politics.
You want my one word in Southern
Sure,
politics?
please, go for it. Please.
Oh, Southern politics has been, it's been a series of changes over time.
Okay.
I've written about it. I wrote a book co-authored a book called The Transformation of Southern Politics. I had a co-author, Walker DeVries. We interviewed 360 people across the South. We
Wow.
had grants from Ford and Rockefeller Foundation.
Okay.
We interviewed a 27-year-old law professor running unsuccessfully for Congress in Arkansas, and when we finished the interview, I thought he was going to be president one day. His name was Bill Clinton. and we interviewed Jimmy Carter when he was governor, and Jody Powell, his press secretary, said, "I'm going to put you in the car with him going from the Capitol to the governor's mansion, which is about a 25-minute drive." He said, this is the one way you'll get his undivided attention. And my co-author, Walter DeVries,
Right.
who was a very experienced campaign consultant, he
Okay.
said that guy could go all the way, and Walter didn't say a whole lot.
Wow. Wow.
So we interviewed a lot of other, I say 360 people.
That's a lot of people.
And so we spent about 2 weeks in each of the old Confederate states.
Wow.
The most difficult interview we had in getting was with George Wallace.
Mm.
And this was after he'd been shot, after he was in that second race for president.
Right.
And he just had a very inept staff.
Mm.
And so finally we called him. And he was one person we felt we had to interview. And so he was going to be down in Mobile, and he said we could interview him there. We got there, and we showed him this little list of one page what we're doing.
Right.
He looked at it and said, "Oh, Ford Foundation, Rockefeller." And he said, "Well, couldn't you fellas just come over to Montgomery? We'd have a nice interview." And we'd be delighted to do that. So we did. We had a good interview with him. And we just interviewed lots and lots of people. We interviewed Dale Bumpers when he was governor.
Right.
He was later senator from Arkansas for
Right.
many years. Reuben Askew when he was governor of Florida. And Bob Graham of Florida.
Yes.
Who was governor, and he then became U.S. Senator for many years.
Right.
And so I said we just interviewed a lot of people across the South. We, of course, interviewed a lot of people in South Carolina.
Yes.
Interviewed Fritz Hollins.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm trying to think of all the people we did. Ernest Finney.
Oh, yeah.
And John West, I'm sure.
Yes.
And I even can't remember exactly who was the governor at the time, but whoever it was we interviewed.
Oh, good.
And a couple of other governors. But Terry Sanford in North Carolina.
Right.
And and then we spent a whole day in Washington interviewing, a week in Washington interviewing members of Congress.
Yeah.
And we managed to master the subway system between the House and the Senate.
That's right.
We got one guy in the Senate interviewing at 2 and somebody else in the House at 2:45.
Yeah.
And I remember really, Jim Mann was congressman from Greenville. We interviewed him, and he got us into a presidential prayer breakfast.
Wow.
Billy Graham spoke, and Richard Nixon was president then. And Andy Young gave the prayer breakfast.
Right.
Then we went to interview Andy Young afterwards in his office.
And he was really young then.
Yep, and I asked him, I said, well, Congressman, what would you have said 10 years ago if somebody told you that you'd become a congressman from Georgia giving the presidential prayer breakfast? There's one that was good reporter questions, because you didn't have to ask any other questions.
Right.
He just talked.
Wow.
And it was just a great interview, really a great interview.
Yeah.
And those interviews, they're all archived at the Wilson Library at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And copies of the people we interviewed from South Carolina are all at What's the place at the College of Charleston?
Oh, Avery.
Avery Research Center.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it was, you know, it was still a lot of good memories from all of that.
I bet.
And so that was especially a good book. And then I did two biographies of Strom Thurmond.
Oh yeah.
The first one was my very late in life dissertation at Emory University, and it became the book Old Strom. No changes at all from the only changes from the dissertation were some changes in the footnotes. And and so that I maintain is the most readable dissertation in the history of Emory University.
Wow, that's awesome.
Well, you know, with Strom, you never were tempted to make up anything.
Then yeah, that's true.
And then we did a second one after he died, and I'd gone to see his daughter Essie.
Oh yeah.
On the first book.
Right.
But she was sort of, then it was, oh, we're just old family friends. And then when she came out after his death,
Right.
so I was there with, you know, about 200 reporters, 200 or 300, maybe more than that,
Wow.
from all over the world.
Wow.
And so afterwards, I saw her daughter, who now lives in East Oaks,
Oh yes.
and Wanda. And so I, you know, introduced myself, and she said, we thought her mother would like to see me. She was resting right then, so I came back and had a nice visit with her.
Yeah.
And later, she was interviewed by, I know what it was, at that interview that day, all these reporters, nobody asked her this question, but you had about 200 just ordinary people in the balcony at a hotel. And her impresario, this lawyer from Compton, California, he said, now anybody else have a question? A woman in the balcony raised her hand.
Wow.
And I asked Essie, would you like to have your name on the statue, of your father's statue with those of his other children?
Ooh.
And Essie always paused before she spoke.
Speak. Right.
She was always just a little time to think, and she said, yes, I believe I would. So later, I ran into John Corson,
Oh, yes.
Senator Corson,
Right.
who I knew when I was covering legislature many years, and we'd gotten to be pretty good friends.
Good.
And he was then chairman of the Building and Grounds Committee, for Senate chairman for the Building and Grounds Committee. So I asked John, would he be willing to escort her to the monument? He said, yeah, he would do that.
Wow. That is so awesome.
So there was all of that.
Yeah.
And then I did a biography of Judge Frank Johnson in Alabama,
Okay.
who was a great federal judge, and he gave the order that allowed the Selma March,
Wow.
which was totally unprecedented.
Yes, indeed.
And he also was the youngest federal judge in the country when he cast a decisive vote that allowed the upholding the Montgomery bus boycott and ruled it constitutional.
Wow.
And so I spent several years on that. You want to know who my editor was?
Now, who was that?
Jacqueline Onassis.
Wow.
So I didn't only met with her a couple times, but once I did ask her, I said, how did you get interested in Judge Johnson?
Right.
And she gave me this sort of quizzical look,
Right.
you know. And she said, I guess it goes back to hearing Jack and Bobby talk about him at the White House.
Wow.
So he was definitely one of a kind.
Yeah.
So the name of the book was Taming the Storm.
Wow.
And he had federal marshals guarding him 24 hours a day for 15 years.
Wow. Wow.
Never lost sleep.
Oh, I bet. And you know, we know that you've written books, you have covered a lot of politics, written a lot of articles and columns, but who is Jack Bass? How could you describe yourself in one word? One word.
Natalie's husband. 2 words.
Jack Bass, thank you so much. I really
All right.
appreciate this. Thank you.
All right.